include Cantina Cast Patreon content.
Hello, Patreon members, and hello, Jonesy.
Hello, Patreon folk.
Welcome to the show. All right, so this has been a long time. I feel like I've my entire life was for this moment here to finally talk about something in the Old Republic, and we're going to talk about Dawn of the Jedi, and we've got a lot to discuss. So I'm going to dispense with the pleasantries here and let you give our quick shout out and thanks to all of our Patreon members.
Oh gosh, I switched pages into I went to my notes rather than your notes. Okay. So special thanks, of course, now part of the Charm members: Rob, Mike, Lauren, Dante, Risk, Justin, Jackson, Sharkman, Dan, Daz, Isabella, Uncle Leon, Josh, Jacob, Steve, Reader, Reborn, and of course, Delusions of Grandeur members: Rod, CJ, and Alex. Thank you all so much for all of your patronage, your continued support. Everybody who contributes to the show, we certainly appreciate it. Remember, please go out to Patreon and look for the post. I pinned it to the top for Rebels Top 3. This is the next From a Certain Point of View. We want to make sure we get you on the show. Rebels Season 1 is coming this Sunday, the Sunday night. So we want to make sure that you are on there for it. And we will do this once a week for the next 4 weeks to make sure that we get Season 1 through 4 all in there. Lauren's going to join us for at least for the first 2 or 3 episodes here. And then we'll wrap up with the 4th one, of course. Lots of great stuff in there. We want to make sure we get your voice heard. So please do sign up. Reply the message, send me a message, whatever it is on Patreon, let me know, and we will get you signed up for it. So check it out.
Yeah, should be a lot of fun. A lot of Rebels coming up here as we get closer and closer. You mentioned on the last show, we're just, 2 months away from the Ahsoka premiere. So crazy to think. But yeah, we're running out of runway here to get some of this stuff done. So got a lot of great content planned ahead of that release date. Okay, so let's talk about Dawn of the Jedi. So anybody that's not familiar with Dawn of the Jedi, this takes place in the Old Republic era. This was released in 2012. Dark Horse Comics did this. The story was by John Ostrander and Jan Duursema. The script was John Ostrander, and the pencils were Jan Duursema. Just quickly, I guess I've read this a lot of times, many times, and I don't know that it ages well. Like, and I don't mean any shade. Like, there's some really fascinating aspects of this storyline. So much that this is what intrigues me talking about this stuff. I get really passionate about it. But at the same time, like some of the writing, it was, and that was the criticism at the time when this came out. Some of the folks said the writing was kind of hit or miss. It was kind of all over the place, if you will. And it was very apparent to me. But I think this might have been your first time reading it, or at least it had been a while since you read it. Give me your thoughts, impressions on this series, I guess, the Force Storm. And again, this is 15 issues in total. We're only going to cover the first 5. We may dip into a little bit of stuff that's probably relevant to the first 5. But what did you think about the first 5 issues anyways?
Yeah, it's been a really long time since I'd read these. I think I'd read them once. And again, this is a very different take on the Jedi, right? I think that's the thing that you have to come into this about, is that unfortunately this suffers from the same types of issues that a lot of Dark Horse comics at the time did. It's very indicative of Dark Horse comics in this moment of time. And John Ostrander was a big part of a lot of these things, for better or worse. And there's a lot of great stuff in here, like you were saying. So it's not throwing any kind of shade at anybody. But I think the thing that jumps out to you really quickly is that very different Jedi Order, right? A very different set of ideals. And I think you have to come into this with the right frame of mind, right? You have to come into this and say, this is the Jedi, the Jedi at the very beginning of their journey of enlightenment and figuring out what it means and what balance means, all within the context of this extraordinary planet and this focused energy of the Force and everything on Tython, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's even very different than what you experience if you're familiar with SWTOR, right? And some of the things that you get from a video game aspect of Tython are a little bit different than what you see in the story with the volatility of everything that's going on. But there's a lot of elements to like about it too, right? The origin of it, this almost like aliens type of idea of it doesn't really answer the questions of where did the Force come from, how do they find out. It's just it's this natural evolution of, after a while, their dedication finally brings you to it. And when you walk us through the story, we'll highlight some of that with the Thoyor and all that. But So I think some of this is when you go into this, you have to have a really good frame of reference. I think there's some really cool things in here, like with the idea that the Jedi weren't the first ones to come up with a lightsaber, right? I mean,
Yeah.
who would have? I mean, and again, this isn't canon anymore, of course, but just that the Jedi didn't come up with it first. Yeah, they didn't think of it first, and then to activate it, you have to basically be very in tune with the dark side. So it's really cool to be able to do that, and to explore those types of aspects of the story within these characters. But we'll talk a little bit. We'll talk a lot about these characters and how Jedi-like they are compared to a more modern Jedi, of course. But overall, it's pretty interesting to be able to see this. And this all takes place, just for reference, about 36,453 years in the past. Before Battle of Yavin, which, I mean, it's approximately that.
Right.
Even though it seems like a pretty specific number to me, but
Yeah.
that's actually what they print. It's approximately 36,453 years BBY, basically. So it's just kind of, it's funny that ways. But, the comic starts off and then it kind of flashes forward about 10,000 years. So
Right.
many generations before the actual story, picks up. But the freedom, the creative freedom to be able to explore, this early aspect had to have been super exciting to be able to do, and very daunting of like, okay, well, how would they become this? And the idea of Ashla, Light Ashla and Dark Bogan, things that have been picked up in canon. But what does that actually mean? What's the exile mean? What's the frame of mind for the Jedi? So a lot of that context we'll talk about tonight is really cool. But again, some inconsistencies of writing. The panels are sometimes a little bit hard to follow. Characters just kind of show up out of nowhere every once in a while.
Yeah.
Some of those are common comic issues, right? These things just kind of show up and happen. But a lot of the writing sometimes is a little bit on the weak side. It doesn't make sense. It's a little campy at times, and just you're like, really, they don't say this. I mean, even George Lucas didn't write dialogue like that.
Yeah. Well, and some of the, again, I guess, there are probably more pros and cons in my opinion here with the comic. But I'm with you there. There are some things that are said. Some of the dialogue, specifically the Sith, the pureblood Sith, like his dialogue was of the time, which kind of it pulls you out of it at times, and it's funny to look back and read it now, I guess. But yeah, you're right. Some of this, there's a lot of inconsistencies with the writing at times. But again, overall, story is really cool. And the idea of this episode is really to kind of talk about, I want to get through the story beginning to end, and then I want to kind of go back and start picking apart some of the stuff that we feel potentially, or maybe we don't feel, I don't know. We're going to debate that about, would we see this in Dawn of the Jedi, the movie that's coming out? Is this stuff that James Mangold can leverage, and how would that look? And what would that do potentially to some of the stuff that we know canonically at this point? So that's kind of the intent of the show, without really getting into every single breakdown and character dissection and all that. We don't have the time for that. So let me start by going through the first issue. And this is probably the most dense of all of the issues in this first arc. It really does introduce some of a lot of these larger themes and a lot of the world building that exists 36,000 years in the past. And I would say this just out of the gate, if we're going to get anything from Dawn of the Jedi, it feels like this first issue is probably where we're going to get some of those bigger chunks that Mangold's probably going to play with here. So again, 36,000 years in the past, we're introduced to what they call the Tho-Yor, which basically looks like a pyramid. And there's a total of 8 of these that are flying around. And it starts off with, we are introduced to this race of people called the Dai Bendu. And the Dai Bendu have been on this planet. It's like this Arctic planet. This pyramid has been there for thousands and thousands of years. They've been compelled to come and worship there, but they're not exactly sure why. It is the Force that's talking to them, yet they don't know how to commune through the Force, and they don't know how to tap into the Force. At some point, this almost becomes, this pyramid, the Tho-Yor almost becomes like, if you've ever seen 2001: A Space Odyssey and the monolith, how it progressed and evolved the human race. It's similar to that. Eventually, it just wakes up and starts calling them into this temple, and it does this all across the galaxy. So all 8 of these things suddenly go around and they start gathering all of the different races, or it's almost like Noah's Ark. They go grab Twi'leks over here. They grab some Wookiees on Kashyyyk. Humans, they go around, grab all these different races, and they all take these races out to Tython, where there's a larger pyramid, which is the 9th pyramid. One of the cool things too is the symbol that's on the Tho-Yor is the Imperial symbol. It's a take on the Imperial symbol, which is kind of why I wore, this shirt tonight, just in honor of that symbol. So there's, there's a reference to what the Empire is using in Star Wars as we know it during the Rebellion that goes all the way back, 36,000 years to where this Tho-Yor was. So they go to Tython. There, all of the Tythons are taught how to live in balance of the Force. And Tython is a world is such that if things get too dark, if they start going too far to the dark side or they go too far to the light side, all these storms start happening, right? The Force is upset, storms start coming in, and so they have to remain in balance. And that's kind of the key aspect of the Jedi at this point, Jedi. The Jedi at this point have to stay neutral because it is in their best interest to stay neutral, because if they don't, the world that they live in becomes very tumultuous and dangerous for them to live. So there's a vested interest in staying right there. Eventually, they realize that this world is so chaotic that they have to figure out a way that, as they start to breed, the non-Jedi people are suddenly at danger. And so what they do is they send the non-Jedi, the non-Force sensitive people out to the two moons. So we get Ashla and Bogan. And like you mentioned earlier, this has made its way into canon at this point. There's a light side moon, a dark side moon kind of thing. Eventually, these moons become places for the Jedi to go to reflect on their going too far to the light side or going too far to the dark side. So, for example, Jonesy, if you did something bad, then they would send you to the moon of Bogan, because when you're on the moon of Bogan, the only thing that you see outside of Tython is the bright light of Ashla. And so it gave you a time to reflect on that. And then vice versa, if you went too far to the light, they would send you to Ashla so that you could look at Bogan, and hopefully that would kind of bring you back more centric. So I like that concept. It's a neat little concept, and we'll get into that here in a little bit more in just a bit. All of this, eventually, they start the Jedi Order, and they have a council just like we're used to. And then towards the very end of the comic, the first issue, we're introduced to the Rakata. And the Rakata have been around for thousands and thousands of years. These guys are like the worst of the worst. Like, they're pure evil. They know how to manifest the dark side. They have these things called the Force Hounds, which are basically their servants that go around to find Force-sensitive people and Force-sensitive worlds, because they have created these massive machines and this incredible architecture that is fueled by the Force. So they actually, and later on, I think they might show it in this arc. If it's not, it's in the other one. It's very similar to The Matrix, where the robots were putting people in beds and then harnessing their electric body power or whatever. There's the same concept here. They're actually putting these Force sensitives in beds, and they're siphoning all of the Force power out of them and using that to power these massive, incredible weapons that they have. So these guys are terribly evil. And we're introduced to these Force Hounds that go around, again, they're Force sensitive humans for the most part, but they can be any race. And they go around and they try to find new worlds and new Force-sensitive people for them to conquer and eat. By the way, they're cannibals, these guys. Right. I mean, they got that going for them, too. And we're introduced at the very end to Zesh, right? And that's the character that we've got on our title card here. He is a Force Hound. He is so in tune with the Force that he is now determined. There's rumors that there is a very rich, Force-rich planet somewhere in the deep core. And all of the other Force Hounds that work for the other Rakata leaders haven't been able to find it, but somehow Zesh knows exactly where it's at. And so the comic ends with Zesh saying, or being tasked with this mission of going out and finding this world of Tython. So you've got these really, you've got the Tythons living in harmony, and they're about to get a big rude awakening when the Rakatan army shows up, and Zesh, because they want to siphon the Force power and eat them. Okay. So I know that was a lot, but that was probably the most dense, again, of the first one. So the second issue, we learned a couple of things. Number one, the Jedi, this is interesting. The Jedi are working in alchemy, and they're doing like these genetic mutations and alterations. And the best example is this creature named Butch. It's a Rancor. And again, the names, by the way, on some of these characters, I'm like, come on, really? So Butch is this Rancor that has been mixed with a dragon. So you imagine a Rancor with dragon wings. Really cool looking thing. Yeah. But they were into this kind of stuff back then. They were all about manipulating genes and splicing different animals, Jurassic Park style. We also learn on Tython there is something called the Abyss, which is this massive chasm that exists under one of these Force temples. And the story goes that as anybody gets closer and closer to the bottom of this thing, you suddenly go mad. They don't know why. There's a lot of experiments going on. It doesn't even, you don't really find this out, the reason or why it's there and what it does until much later, I think in the second or third arc of the entire series. But for now, just kind of put that in the back of your mind. This chasm is down there. It does play a part in this in just a little bit. And then we get introduced to, I guess, would be the ensemble cast outside of Zesh. And so we're introduced to Hawk and Tasha Rowe. These guys are Twi'leks, and their backgrounds are really not important, honestly. In the grand scheme of the story here, not important. But we're introduced to Shay Koda. She's a human, and these are all Force sensitives. They're all part of the Jedi Council, or part of the Jedi Order at this time. We're introduced.
I think Shay Koda is actually a Dathomiri. I think.
Oh, was she?
I think that's what she's supposed to be. Yeah.
Okay, that might make sense too. And well, I have a story about that too, but for another time, because this is where Legends gets kind of weird. Then we're introduced to Master Kwang Jang, who was kind of like this Morpheus character. He was a Jedi Master, but he had like this
like Morpheus.
He let the
or Blade,
or Blade, yeah. It was again a sign of the times, right? 2012, we're probably coming off that era or whatever. But he looked like Morpheus, but he very very powerful Jedi, probably arguably the most powerful of this group. We talked about Butch. Then there's Seknos Wrath. He's the Sith pureblood. He's kind of like the playboy who talks like Surfer Dude 2010 Weezer speak almost at times. And then the last character that we're introduced very, very shortly is Dagon Locke. And Dagon Locke was a member of the Jedi Council. He was sent to Bogan to repent for Force visions that he was having. He plays a much larger role in the second and third series. But it is interesting to know that he is somebody that has fallen and that he did fall because of those Force visions that he was having. That is the ensemble cast. They all have this vision of Zesh. They see him and they're not exactly sure why. And it's kind of, basically it's foretelling of his coming, essentially is what happens. And the second issue ends with the ship that had Zesh and had the Rakatans on there crashing into the planet of Tython. And Zesh is the only one that's alive. We get into issue 3. Zesh is having a battle with these guys now. They all saw the crash. They head out there. They have a battle. There's a big Force battle. Shay Koda, the Dathomirian woman, she eventually picks up Zesh's Force saber, and she's able to ignite it because she taps into the dark side so much. And that's where we're first introduced to this concept that these Force sabers, not lightsabers, but Force sabers, can only be ignited through the use of powering and harnessing the dark side, right? As they start to do this with Zesh's presence on Tython, the storms progressively start to get worse and worse over this issue and the next 2 issues, because Tython is being thrown off in balance, right? There's too much dark side energy coming from the ship, the Rakata, Zesh. Now these Jedi, they're fighting and they're tapping into the dark side and trying to beat Zesh at the same time, right? There's the big battle that's going on there. Eventually, Zesh retreats into the abyss and doesn't go that far. We'll catch up with him in a little bit. They sent out a search party to look for at the crash wreckage to kind of understand what happened there. Force storms are starting to pick up all over the place. And then Zesh has a memory at the very end of issue 3 where he realizes that the reason this ship crashed, he had something to do with it. And he's not exactly sure why. He was a part of it in some way. He's the only survivor. In fact, he gets away. You see it. He gets away on a lifeboat, or a lifeboat of sorts, right? So that's kind of where that issue ends. All right, we get into 4, which is the horrors of Abyss. And now the Jedi Council are starting to convene about the Force storms, right? They realize, holy crap, there's a lot of Force storms going on around here. We need to do something about it. They realize that the dark side is in flux. It's imbalancing the world of Tython. And so they decide they're going to have to take action. And they kind of tie all this back to the ship that's crashed and Zesh, of course. We get another flashback about the Rakatan ship going down. Then we get Zesh surviving on Tython. He's down in the abyss. There's all these kind of weird creatures down there. They never really explain. They look like the worms almost from the Beetlejuice, or like the worms from Dune in some way, right?
Yeah,
it's probably a throwback.
They have like these mouths that split into like 4 triangles, basically, that spread out.
Yeah. And so he's caught.
Yeah, there's like Little Shop of Horrors kind of thing going on.
Exactly. So he's caught down there as he's, as part of his retreat into the abyss. He's caught fighting these things. And it's then that Tasha, Shay, and Seknos show up. They appear there, and they realize, okay, we can't let this guy die. He's fighting these big worms. And these worms are called Sarls for what it's worth. So they go down there and decide they're going to go ahead and fight him. And so they stave off the Sarls. And while they're fighting and doing all these, trying to keep these things at bay, Zesh decides that he's going to just walk away because they're his enemies. And the best thing that he can do is let them fight this thing now that they're occupied with it. And he almost kind of betrays them at that point. All right. So then we get into the 5th issue. So at the 5th issue, so Zesh realizes he sees Shay Coda. So Shay Coda is someone who's his love interest later down the road, just to spoil that, sorry. It's his love interest, but he sees her and it's his first touch with the light side. So up until now, he's never had any contact with the dark side, has been completely void of any light side whatsoever. He's been abused, manipulated, beaten. They use him as a tool, the Rakata. And suddenly Shay Coda is this bright light, and he's touching the light side for the first time. And so he decides that he's going to go ahead and go back. And so he turns back over, he heads back over there and helps out Shay Coda fight this off. At this point, the search party that was looking for these, so now we get Hawk, Master, Kwang Jang, and a couple of others. They end up catching up with the entire group. And Kwang Jang decides that he's in communication with the Jedi Council. And they have this crazy thing where the Jedi Council start to concentrate their power, and they use Kwang Jang as this conduit to call down force lightning from the force storms that are above, and they strike Zesh down to kind of put him out of his, put him out of decommission so all of this chaos can stop.
Yeah,
it's a really cool concept.
Yeah, this idea of battle meditation was also present like in the Darth Bane books.
Yep.
And to an extent with High Republic in a very different, like on a completely different way, I think. But this idea of battle meditation in like as a commune type of thing or a cumulative power and focusing it into a single a person in particular, I think it's very prevalent in these older books.
Yeah. So now that they've kind of put him out of commission, Shay Coda has an opportunity to essentially just kill him. And she doesn't, of course, right? She can't do that. He's completely disabled at this point. He's telling her, just go ahead and eat me, because he's used to that's their ultimate fate, right? If they die, then the Rakata just literally eat them. And so he tells her, you can have me and eat me, whatever.
Yeah,
and so
the honor of eating my heart. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
She's like, what?
What are you talking about, you creep? So, and of course, Master Kwang Jang, he was hurt in channeling that much force energy as well. So at this point, they take both of these guys. Zesh is recovering with the Selkath, and then Kwang Jang, he recovers as well. You kind of think he's dead. They almost play it up as though he died, harnessing that much force energy. But he does live, thankfully. And then they send Zesh to Bogan. So he's kind of converted at this point, at the very end of this last issue here. He's kind of converted in some way. At least he sees the light side. He understands that he's had a rough past, and he has friends now that he's never had. He understands that these people were actually trying to help him, which was very alien to him, no pun intended. And so they feel like, hey, what's the best thing that we can do for this person? Why don't we exile him to a planet, to the moon of Bogan, so that he can reflect on his dark side use, see the light of Ashla, and come more centric, so that he can, essentially join the ranks and bring balance back to the Force there on Tython.
Let's reflect on the light, this one thing you've never known and have no idea how to interpret it, and let's do that without guidance.
Right.
Meanwhile, we have another former Jedi out there doing something similar. So good luck.
Yeah, exactly. Right, and that's the point. Like the book, the last issue of the Force Storm ends with Dagon Locke. Again, this is the Dark Jedi. Well, I shouldn't say he's not Dark Jedi, but the guy that was exiled for tapping into the dark side too much. He's on this moon, and he has this line about the prophecy is going to be fulfilled. And you're not really sure where this is going to go exactly yet, but the idea that you've got somebody who's been there, can't get off the planet, has tapped into the dark side, and now you've sent somebody who is really in tune with the dark side doesn't bode well, right? Something's probably going to happen there. It doesn't bode well for the future of their relationship, or certainly what's going to happen on Bogan. And that's it. That's how the Force Storm ends. Thank you.
All right, thanks, everybody.
We'll see you guys next week. Yeah. All right. So let me do this. So we'll dial it back now. And I want to put one quick thing in perspective here. So the timeline. So again, we're 36,000 years in the past, by the time we get to Zesh, it's fast forward like 10,000. So the Thoyor have already come in. The Dai Bendu have been on Tython. They've had about 10,000 years of worshiping the Force, I guess, or being in tune with the Force. And they have Force powers at this point as well. A lot of the powers that we've seen in Star Wars canon movies. And then there's a lot of stuff that we've seen like in the video games, specifically in KOTOR and SWOTOR, of course. That makes sense. That Despo War, where we didn't really talk about this, but at one point when they had exiled all of the people, I guess they had sent the non-Force users to the moons. Eventually, over the course of 10,000 years, or I forget how many, maybe it was 1,000 years, they started kind of building up an army and were almost resentful of the Jedi Order and resentful of the Force users. And so it started this war of non-Force users versus Force users trying to come back to their home planet of Tython. That's significant only if you read the second and third arcs. Really doesn't play a big part in here, but they do mention it quite a bit that there was this war, and that war happened at 25,805. It's crazy. This is so mind-blowing. The scale of some of this stuff is just crazy to even think about. This series here with the Force Hounds and Zesh and the Rakata, this technically takes place in 25,793. The Dark Jedi don't come around to 24,500. So we've almost got the better part of, 1,400 years between this and the Dark Jedi. We're not talking about the Sith. That's just the Dark Jedi, right? The Jedi that still follow the code and all that, but they're tapping into the dark side. And then we don't get to the Sith. Like the actual Sith Lords don't come around to 6,900. That's like, 20 or 17,000 years later before we get to Darth Bane and Malgus and that whole lineage and the rule of two. That's when all this starts. So I just want to put that in perspective, because when I talk about the Old Republic, the one thing that always just is really fascinating and irritating because it doesn't line up is just the amount of time that takes place, and yet it doesn't feel like much progresses in, I don't know, 1,000 years. It's like, we painted the droids now. They look a different color, but we really haven't progressed the technology much, you know?
Yeah, and the whole idea of the Sith Empire and everything else, it's really difficult to have a good kind of idea of what the time frames look like. Like, what are the windows of time of when you have, Satine Shan or Satil Shan versus some of these other ones, and the legacy of all of this. And this is like way, way, way before anything that you get in the Old Republic that you're used to. This is truly dawn of the Jedi, like dawn of the Force users in general.
Yeah.
And this really early journey on, so again, there's no concept of Sith Lords. They're just a Sith race at this point, or a Sith species, I guess, really more specifically.
Yeah. All right, so let's start talking about some of the things then that kind of stood out. And we'll start with the Thoyor, just chronologically, I guess, for now. So these big pyramids that were, again, you made a good point. In talking in the interview with James Mangold, I think what he said is he wants to tell this very biblical story, right, of how the Force came to be and how the Jedi came to be. And for me, they're very two distinct things, like at least from a Legends perspective, and they make it very clear. Even the Thoyor, we don't know how long they've been around. Like I've seen references of the Force being around as far back as 100,000 years before then, right? So at some point it did start. I don't think he's going to go that far back because I don't know what you would tell at that point. I think it's more interesting to tell kind of this era of here's the Force. It's been around. Maybe he gets into the mystics of it all. Maybe the Thoyor or some other entity is part of that. But the really, I guess, the catchy part is knowing how the Jedi Order was formed and how did they learn to control the Force itself, right? I think that's probably where the more focus is going to be with Dawn of the Jedi movie. But I guess, what do you think about the Thoyor? Do you think it's something that would make its way into the movies or conceptually at all?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of aspects of it. Is that first time of when you hear that calling, right? And again, it makes so much sense that it's over time, and you can't dwell on it because that's not super interesting. I think the idea with these pyramids is very much like the pyramids in our own life. I mean, that's the inspiration for a lot of this stuff is
right.
We have these really mysterious, natural or not natural, these things that have been constructed, but it just
wonders
seems impossible.
Of the world.
Yeah, the wonders of the world. Yeah, the things that we like. How is this even possible with the technology at the time and things like that? And so, if you were to take that and say, "Oh, well, really, it's this mystic energy and power." Now, why a physical pyramid would be the manifestation of the Force and be the will of the Force doesn't make any kind of sense. So I think there's holes with some of that stuff, but it's more of a the conduit of the Force. This is and they talk a lot about throughout the book. Not a lot. They mentioned it a few times, but the whole Despot War. One of the things was they wanted to revolt, not necessarily against the Jedi, but they equated the Jedi to the will, in finger quotes, will of the Force.
Mm-hmm.
They were the ones carrying forward everything about the Force was all embodied, through the Jedi, and I think that's a really interesting concept. And so when I think about things like the Despot War, I think that is something that could very much be referenced. But the Thoyor specifically, that there is some sort of entity that brings humanoid races and species to awareness of the Force. There has to be something to generally make them that moment of enlightenment, or that period of enlightenment. And I like what this book did, and it was really subtle and didn't say much about it, was the Dai Bindu. Basically, it was when they found peace, and like true peace and calm is when they were finally ready to be open to it, and that's when the Thoyor spoke and invited them.
Yeah.
Right. And then they calmed the other race. All of the other ones that they talked about, the Wookiees and the Dathomiri, each one of them had their own kind of shortcomings. But when the pyramid spoke and rang out, all of a sudden they found that balance and that calm, that they weren't teetering on one side or the other. They started to understand this a little bit better. And of course, once they get the Tython, those lessons become much more apparent, because the consequences are so much more dire and very obvious in that way.
Yeah.
So again, that there's some object or some construct that helps get you to that period of enlightenment, I think makes sense to an extent. Will it be pyramids? I hope not, because the pyramids are, it's like you have to really suspend a lot of belief to get to that point without any kind of context around it. And so I'm really curious how James Mangold would approach something like that, to understand how does that actually happen. But if it were to be the Thoyor in this instance, and they lifted it straight out, I think it works well enough. It just, you might just have people a little confused right off the bat, because they're not necessarily stepping into it, understanding what they're actually seeing. And why does it have the Imperial logo on it? That's a little too on the nose, right?
Yeah.
So some aspects of that, I think design-wise, would probably shift and change a little bit too. But
Yeah.
in general, though, it's not a bad theory or a bad thing to lift and bring into the screen with some minor adjustments.
So how would you feel, again, so here we go with the I don't know, conspiracy theories, or if we want to call it that, but or maybe it's just theory and speculation. But what if they went with like Mortis? Okay, sorry, I hate to bring Mortis in, but if you think about Mortis, as that shuttle is approaching, it looks like one of these Thoyors, right? The planet looked like a pyramid, like a diamond pyramid kind of thing. Yeah. And so maybe there's an opportunity here to show the Thoyor. Maybe they don't even call them that, right? But there are these entities out there, and they give it that same look. In fact, I just pulled up the link where I wanted to make sure I didn't get my wires crossed, but I was like, man, I could have sworn it looks almost exactly the same. And they don't put
close. Yeah.
It's very close. And I'm with you too. Like, I don't know about the symbol. Like, it was cool at the time. Like, oh man, this is how far back this goes. But really, the symbol goes back 36,000 years. Yeah, I don't know about that.
Right.
And they kind of explained it, right? If you look at this shirt is not exactly, this is the symbol on my shirt right now. This is a symbol that's used by the Sith during this era, but it is a take on that. And you've got 8 points, which are the 8 pyramids that went around all over the place. And then you've got what essentially is a center point, a larger center point, which is the main pyramid that was on Tython, where all of these came to. And so all 9 of these points makes a symbol. So I like the thought and the idea behind giving it something there, right? But I think it could be possible for them to say what we see with Mortis is maybe there are 8 of these things or 9 of these things that go around back, 1,000 or 36,000 years ago, or how far back they go with this thing. And that would be a way to kind of tie it into something that's already been established in canon. I like the idea, honestly, of it being, something more than just, they just tapped into it. So I'll give them credit for that. I'm probably, I don't know, I'm probably 50-50 on them using the Thoyor. I think there are other things in here that are probably going to make their way up or appear with higher success than this. But
yeah, I like the idea of blending those together, because then you have daughter of Ashla, so the daughter was the light side, the son of Bogan, is the dark side, and you have the father who's Tython, and I like that it works so well with how Mortis was set up with this holy trinity, if you will, and being able to balance that out and trying to keep things in balance. And what we saw in Mortis is very reminiscent of this, maybe not as maybe it may be more subtle, and it was more of the cycle of life thing that was happening every single day. But you definitely saw things start to fall apart really quickly when Mortis got out of balance and when things started going sideways, especially once you start killing some of those characters off, right?
Yeah.
And
right.
so those are elements that you can definitely blend in with this type of story, and I think they work. At some point, you kind of have to pick a path if you're going to go that way, though, and I think you're probably leaning back a little bit more into more of the comic adaptation where you get away from these central characters necessarily that that represent this, and you go on a journey of exploration rather than just saying, here's the father and the daughter and the son. Although it would be really cool if Dawn of the Jedi were to end up in that place to where
Yeah.
we end up at Mortis. Maybe we don't start there, but that's where it evolves to. And that explains, and that's the backstory of Mortis. I think that would be an interesting element, although I can hear Mike Rondo rolling in his grave a little bit of saying, or rolling in his pipe tobacco or whatever, and just saying that, why do we have to explain everything? Yeah, and that's a fair argument in that regard too. But I like that would be the destination. That wouldn't be the starting point for us.
It could be too. I mean, they could easily replace the Tho Yor with the Celestials.
Yeah.
We only know of 3 technically, but there could be, unless you call it, well, I guess Aboleth in Legends was considered one, and there's whatever it was. But I mean, they could easily explain that the Tho Yor.
I love the idea of the Celestials being just a different embodiment of the Force, and maybe not these giant physical pyramids, but you get these spiritual bodies and that's what appears to you, and that's. Again, because that's what you can understand and comprehend, that type of thing would make sense.
Yeah, almost like the Greek gods in some way, right? On Mount Olympus, and they've got their champions, and these are the Force Hounds. I'm just tossing out ideas, but that would be a way. I mean, maybe that's too on the nose and too close to what we have now, but conceptually, that would be one way to approach this. Okay, so I think one of the things that I think will definitely make its way into Dawn of the Jedi is Tython. It was already introduced in the, was it Book of Boba Fett? Was it? Or was it Mandalorian? It all blends together. It was Mandalorian, I think.
That was Mandalorian, yeah.
Yeah. So having Tython there would be, I think, a given. Like, it just seems like a natural place. In Legends...
But it's so different than what we see in this comic book, right? There's nothing similar about it at all.
Right. It looks like California, Sunnyside, California. in the TV, which is where they filmed it, to be fair.
Yeah.
But yeah, so and I think I had that same feedback when we watched the episode. I was like, oh man, it's Tython, but it looks like nothing like Tython at all. There are probably some areas of Tython as far as and Tython is a world you can explore in SWTOR, so I can vividly tell you in great degree like what that world looks like in all the different areas and stuff. But the one thing in Legends, just to be clear, they eventually so the Jedi Order actually leaves Tython at some point because it's just too volatile. They realize there's too much going on here. They end up leaving and going to Ossus, which is technically the very first Jedi planet, even though Jedi Jedi, when they finally changed the name, I guess, for trademark purposes or whatever they do, they eventually go to Ossus.
There was a dispute over the trademark.
Right, yeah. So they had to rename, change the website. It was a big mess. But at some point, they do end up going to Ossus. And so when you talk about, it's similar to like Dathomir and Korriban. Korriban has always been historically the place where the Sith started in Legends. But when you get to canon, it's Malachor. Or, there's other planets. And so it's the same thing. There's like 2 or 3 planets that the Jedi were a part of, and there's 2 or 3 planets that the Sith were part of. But Tython this is where everything started, like all of the origins of the Force, everything started back here, even in canon as in Legends. So I think it makes sense that if we're going to have a primary setting for all of this to take place, why not use Tython? Why introduce a new planet at this point?
Right. Yeah, I'm agree with you. I think this is the home of the Jedi. This is the origin of the Jedi. I think this is where it embodies the idea of balance and the consequences and maybe understanding better what balance means, right? And that's something this comic explores, is the way that they interpret balance is not the same as what the Jedi in the, in the George Lucas era of storytelling is cognizant of the Jedi. Like, the Jedi don't use Force lightning in George Lucas's Star Wars, right? They use it all the time in various different ways in this Dawn of the Jedi series, right? They use all sorts of things and then they don't, while they they have concerns about it. And so in particular, what's his name?
Seknos Wrath.
Yeah, Seknos Wrath. Yeah. In him in particular, he's very, very ego driven. There's a lot of hubris in the Jedi and natively, I think, with some of the stuff, which is, I think, probably speaks more to their young age, considerably when it just comes to how long species been around. But, that he's able to, I've been working on this, and he basically does a giant force ball lightning or whatever. But again, it's nothing compared to what like Zesh can do on the other side. So
Yeah.
I like that that we would take Tython and explore those types of themes and understand better what balance truly means, especially when we look at even like Last Jedi and what we see the symbol on the floor, right? And what does the Jedi Prime actually mean? Who is the Jedi Prime? Is this something that would link to it as well? This story does not explore any of that, of course, but you have other elements of how far back do you really want to go. But I think it all comes back to Tython. I think this is where, whether you born the Jedi there specifically or you locate them all there, doesn't really matter one way or the other as long as you end up there. But how this planet has evolved, I think if you're going to show it differently than what we saw in Mandalorian, you have a little bit long, you have a longer path to kind of get there. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's easier to do that and say it's chilled out over time as the galaxy is sprawled and balance was achieved because of Luke Skywalker and Anakin Skywalker after Return of the Jedi.
Yeah.
I mean, we're just seeing it at one moment in time, of course.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the balancing and the force storms and that concept of? I mean, you touched on it a little bit here, but I actually enjoy the way they've kind of worked that into the planet itself, and I don't know if that, it probably doesn't have it's probably not a good it's a long-term strategy to stay on that planet because of, the lull or the pull to the dark side is so strong, and it just feels like it's a very difficult thing to maintain that balance. And for the reason that the Jedi left, like, why put yourself in that position? Go practice somewhere else where you don't have to worry about the planet being at war with you at times, essentially. And that's what it was. I mean, I think there was a couple times in there where they were talking about they were at war with their planet because they had to get things in balance. And if they didn't, they were going to get ripped apart and cities were getting destroyed left and right. I mean, it's not an easy place to live in.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. This isn't... They didn't want to be at war with the planet, right? Because they knew if it went much further, then the planet would basically tear itself apart, feeding on this dark energy. And so I think when you want to present this, to an audience, and you want to show what I like the idea that the planet is alive in this way, right? It's another character that you have to consider, even though it doesn't have any dialogue or anything like that. It's something you always have to have in the back of your mind. But I'm with you 100%. This is not something you can just lean on the entire thing. It can maybe be a presence or a consideration, but it can't drive your story, right? And I think that's the one thing that this fell apart a little bit on, is that the story didn't tell it strong enough of saying, well, it's just this bad character. Okay, well, does the planet want to get back into balance, or does the planet never want to be in balance? Because it seems like if you have a really strong dark side presence, then the planet, if it wants to be in balance, you'd have a severe light side movement, right? It would reject all of that. But
yeah,
in this case, it's like, no, it's feeding it. So it's almost like it feeds too much of it, which again, that's why I kind of made the comment about The Mandalorian. If there's been so much good energy, then it's just all green and happy and lots of sun and everything. Maybe it's the other way. I don't know if it goes both ways on Tython or not, but so I think it's kind of a short-lived element of the story. But I like that, I don't necessarily like the extreme idea of the lightning and things like that, but death and decay and not able to grow, famine, those types of things I think those types of elements are much more relatable, and you can show them in different ways too. They have a longer effect about why would you want to stay on this planet if you can't grow food, right? Yeah, the environment is really tough, but also the earth itself is rejecting you. It's not just from the sky, it's from everything else around you. The beasts or the plant life, everything else is just so out of whack that it's just untenable.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I think would probably, and again, going with the Mortis theory, when you look at so the moons of Ashla and Bogan, I love that concept of being forced to go to that moon, as draconic as it sounds and maybe ineffective as this may be, but the idea of having to sit on a planet exile or a moon exiled and forced to look at the light side because you've been dark, or dark because you've been light, trying to stay neutral. Conceptually, I think all that really works. But what's really interesting is when you look at the symbols for the son and the daughter of Mortis, it is the Bogan symbol and it is the Ashla symbol, right? So another way that you could work in the moons, tie them to the Celestials, tie them to the Mortis arc as well. I think there's probably some natural connections they could kind of pull all this stuff together. Even maybe it was always that way. I don't know. They've never really talked about it, to be quite frank. So, but if they didn't, then I think there's probably some natural ways to kind of just pull all this stuff together and make it seem like this was one grand design, many, many years ago when that Mortis trilogy came out and, they came up with the symbols. I think the symbols for Ashla and Bogan were actually already in Legends. I think they pulled those for the Mortis arc when they did that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
So, but yeah, I think the idea of these moons and playing a role in some way in Dawn of the Jedi would be kind of nice to see as well. All right, so let's move into the Rakata, and I think they're so fascinating, honestly, in a lot of different ways. I probably didn't give them enough time in kind of the breakdown. They're by the time we get to, I don't remember the exact same time, but eventually they are on the down. Like they're starting to dwindle in numbers, and eventually they phase out. But even by the time you get to SWTOR, they're few and far between. Many of them have gone mad. They've locked themselves up in these dark. They've got a couple things that they introduce, right? We talked about Force sabers already. So essentially the prototype of a lightsaber. And eventually down the road, we'll get into the Jedi will come across proto sabers, which were the lightsabers that had the backpack, with the little cord to power them. And eventually they get into the kyber crystal type lightsabers. But then they also introduced hyperdrive technology. So hyperdrive technology, as we know it in Star Wars, quote, today, came from Rakata technology. And the way it worked is a Rakatan ship had crashed, and the human scientists, I think it was on Corellia, went through and reverse engineered the technology, and eventually they figured out a way to get hyperspace travel from these guys. So they gave us that. They also gave us the Starforge, which they don't talk about in this series. They mentioned that they have these grand machines that are powered by the Force, but this Starforge essentially can create anything it wants. It can create Star Destroyers, it can create people, food, whatever it needs to. It's just this massive machine that can create anything it wants to. And the design of that Starforge looks like the end of the hilt for that Force saber as well, right?
It's called OP, is what it's called. Yeah.
Yeah, right. They give us the Force Hounds, of course. There's almost like a, I don't know if it's ever really been said, and shame on me for not knowing this, but I've always had this idea in the back of my head that they were genetically creating Force Hounds and creating genetic beings that were Force sensitive in some way for their own purposes, of course. But they never really get into the origin of the Force Hounds, if they were just Force sensitive people, because you get the sense that the Rakata weren't able to find these Force sensitives. Although they were in tune with the dark side, they had certain limitations in why they had to rely on Zesh and other Force Hounds to do some of this other work, because that's just not what they did. They were all about, they could force lightning all day long, and they had built the Force sabers to, for as weapons. But apart from that, they weren't really seeing Force visions, and they weren't able to even in the games, they couldn't use the Force to jump higher, run faster. So they had some limitations there, but it almost felt like at times that they were creating these Force beings, creating the Force Hounds, creating Force sensitive beings for those batteries to power all of their weapons. So let me pause there. I guess the question is, at some point in that movie, I would expect there to be an antagonist of some sort. Maybe it is the Rakata. Maybe it feels like this could be the big bad that they're up against. And if not, maybe it's something else. But, there's an opportunity here to kind of introduce the origins of a lot of things like we talked about, right? Hyperdrive and Force sabers and all that stuff. But what do you think about them?
Yeah, again, I agree with you. I think this also goes back. The other alternative to this would be the Despot War, or you merge these two together, right? So the resentment that's built up over time, and then as these other cultures have started to expand, and you get the Rakatan Empire here, the Infinite Empire, it makes a lot of sense for that to be a centralized, someone you can unite against, or you have to unite your people in order to, to reject and repel this invasion force of sorts, right? And to that, it has its origins a bit in your own people. is more interesting, I think, in that respect. But then they just go on this completely different tangent and they enslave the galaxy, and you've got your first kind of empire from what we would, from what we would recognize, at least from an empire perspective. So I like that we would have this, and then we would bring them forward, and we'd say, okay, here's who you're going to fight, at least in this, maybe the first movie, and then maybe they don't rely on them the entire time, because then you can evolve the story over thousands of years with little impact at all, right? You don't even have to keep the same characters at that point. But I like the idea, though, that these characters are force sensitive. They have a very structured hierarchy. They have a very this idea of praetors. They each have their force hounds. Again, you have mentality of the Sith, of how we would interpret the Sith, right?
Yeah,
Of
very
only the
much.
strongest survives, right? And while they do have this kind of cannibalistic idea, which I don't think would probably get brought to the screen,
Right.
you have that idea, though, of saying, well, no, I get conquering rights, and if I challenge you and our force hounds fight, it's to the death. Like, there's only one survivor, and that's very much like a rule of two, legacy type, or something that you could draw on, of saying, okay, well, maybe these ancient texts that Bane read, maybe some of this dates back to some of this, and this idea of culling the weak, even though maybe it wasn't as specific or that wasn't the intention of it, but you do have its origins of saying we cull the weak, we don't cull the strong. And there's a lot of ways you can kind of build on that and go from there too. But
Yeah.
so I think this is a very real threat, I think, to the Jedi in particular, if they can get out of their own way. But that's the problem. Like you said, they're kind of dwindling. They're already on a bit of the decline. There are these other crime lord families and other aspects that are going on in this part of the galaxy. They're all kind of within the same area, but they again, it's very difficult to get the Tython, because, and we've seen this a bit in even canon type of works, of like how you get there is very. We saw this with Exegol. It's very similar to how you get to Exegol. It's a very treacherous path, and you have to be able to guide it either by the Force, or you need a really good map to do it. And they don't have the map in this time frame in order to accomplish that type of task very consistently, right? So
Yeah.
the Thoyor were a big part of that originally. But again, I think all those elements come together pretty nicely to give you something that you can borrow a lot from, even if it's not maybe specific. Do you want an alien bad guy in a movie? I don't know if that flies as well these days, but possibly. And again, some of the same elements you could definitely lift off the page, even if it's not verbatim.
Yeah. Yeah. This comic kind of, I mean, it dabbled in the bad aliens as being kind of the shadow here at times, but then there was kind of this internal struggle with Zesh in particular, right?
Yeah.
The conflict, the inner conflict there and even with the other ones too. I mean, there was a great moment in there where they all started kind of floating. They started going too far to the dark side, and they were having like these visions of, like, they were almost, they were visions, but they were like hallucinations almost at times. So this is like the main cast at one point. So there was some struggle with them too, and what that meant, and what it was alluding to was the temptation of dark side and how powerful it can be. In fact, what's his name? Wrath. Eventually, he is one of the first ones that is. I mean, he's long dead by then, but he is one of the I guess he's one of the very first Sith that really start to enjoy the power the dark side gives you. I don't remember if it's in this particular arc, but I know in either the second or the third arc, you get a sense that, oh, this guy is like, he's about to go down that path. And again, it's still many, many years before that happens, but you do see those first steps of, wow, there's something more here and something super powerful about the dark side, even though they can't do it because, again, like we talked about with the planet and the jeopardy and risk that brings.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of foreshadowing in this first arc with Seknos Roth, because his grandfather and father and grandmother, I think, are all, again, the hierarchies and the matriarchy and the patriarchy are very much part of a lot of these cultures. So there's a lot of parent, child relationships that are still here, as well as relationships in general. They talk about that a couple of different times of, less savory relationships or more primalistic type of relationships, if you will, or I don't know, sex, all that good stuff. Anyway, but it's but you get that idea of like they continue to warn him about going too far with some of this stuff, and that he shouldn't do that. But there's this certain rebellious aspect to him as well.
Right.
That's part of the family. And again, you start to look at this hubris of the Jedi and say, do they even understand what they're meddling with? They kind of do, but they are doing all of these different things that just feel very wrong compared to what we're used to with Jedi. And again, even when you couple it with the less egotistical ones, but they're, fly beast. I mean, they just command the animals. There's no symbiotic nature with it. It's an
Right.
experiment. We don't name the experiments was one quote in the book. So,
Mm-hmm.
you get those types of things that don't make sense as to why, these don't make sense. These aren't our Jedi, but you start to see why those things are possible. I think Seknos Roth is a great example of that with a lot of the hubris. He knows he knows he's a god, basically to women, and very sexualized in many different ways, but also not afraid to tinker with the other parts of the Force to expand his own horizons, which of course we've seen countless times.
Yeah.
A very slippery slope of going down the path of the dark side and letting it consume you.
Yeah. Doesn't always end well.
Right.
So let's end on this last topic, and this is the Jedi themselves. I kind of save, I think, the best for last. So the origin here, so the Dai Bendu race, this translates, so the word Jedi, and I think JE translates into mystic, and Dai translates into center, and that's how we get the mystic center. So that's technically what Jedi means, mystic center. Again, going all back that concept of
They're the one in the middle.
yeah, the one in the middle, right? True neutral, true north kind of thing in the middle there. Let's talk about the Jedi Oath, or what we call the Jedi Order Code. And I'm gonna bring this up on the screen because it's better to actually see it.
Very peculiar, oath here.
Yeah, and I want to and hopefully you can see that there, but that doesn't really work, does it? But it says, let me blow this up real quick and see if, okay, I'm going to have to go to
that's good.
enhance. Okay, so the Jedi, this is the code, very different from the Jedi code that we know today. It says there is no ignorance, there is knowledge, there is no fear, there is power. I am the heart of the Force. I am the revealing fire of light. I am the mystery of darkness, in balance with chaos and harmony, immortal in the Force. So it reads very balanced, right? As it probably should. I mean, they talk about the light, they talk about the dark, they kind of put a nice bow on it and say that, in balance with chaos and harmony. This seems like a very hard way to live your life. Like, I don't even know that this is possible, right? Well, and especially on Tython. Like, again, the main reason they stay balanced is not because it's the right thing to do. I mean, there's an aspect of it, but they physically have to stay in balance for them to live. And it's when they finally leave Tython and they go to Ossus, is that then they have the liberty to start exploring down the dark side path. And that leads to Dark Jedi, which leads to the Sith, et cetera, right? So this makes sense. I mean, I don't know that they'll ever introduce something like this. I think it would be kind of cool if they actually did have a Jedi code that was different, although we've never really even had the Jedi code explicitly said in anything, at least the movies. It's come out in, I mean, Kanan says it at one point in Star Wars Rebels, and they've done it at a couple other places. Of course, it's appeared everywhere in the books, even canon books. But in the movies, they've never really even kind of talked about this. But I don't know. I think I think this is one of the better things that came out of this, was the idea that they had their own Jedi code, and it seems very relevant to the Jedi of this time, especially given what they're trying to do and where they live.
Yeah, and you see the slippery slope in it, though. I mean, there is no fear, there is power. I mean, that's a straight up Sith line, effectively.
Right, yeah.
Right. I mean, that's basically embracing your power and breaking your chains. I mean, that's kind of the path you start going down. But you're right. This is very much the embodiment of both sides, the dark and the light, and trying to find what that middle ground looks like, and at least recognizing all the different things that are around you, even though you are. I agree with you. This isn't really sustainable in this format, right? Because it's just you are constantly at war with yourself, and we see it in these characters, right? So I mean, we see that these characters are constantly. I mean, the planet is contributing to some of it in the story. I think they make that relatively clear, but we see it in the characters that they continue to struggle with. They know what the right thing to do is, but they also know what they want to do, and they just kind of go forward, and maybe they get rung, they ring themselves back in a little bit. But there's really no teachings with some of it except, well, don't go too dark because you'll go out to Bogan. I mean, that's kind of what they, threaten you with, is they threaten you with exile, effectively, which doesn't seem super effective to me, because that's a fear tactic. And if there's no fear, there's power. I just use the code here against them for the most part of saying, okay, well, if there's no fear, there's power. I'm not afraid of going to Bogan, so I'm going to embrace the power and therefore I'm more inclined to go on one of the dark side. And even like Zesh says this with the Shea Coda, right? It's he senses and he uses the word intoxicating, right, which is definitely of the dark side. And again, that's very clear in the book, but she embraces it. The thing that he's kind of enlightened by with her is her defiance of wanting to cave into that, and her sense of responsibility and duty and commitment to her fellow Jedi as well.
Yeah.
Right? And so those are some of the things that he finds very inspiring in some of that. And I think in this code, that's where you see I am the revealing fire of light. That part comes through, front and center. He expected her to run, but she didn't. She stood fast because that was the easy way out. And that's not what they do. They don't take the easy way out. Mm-hmm. They stand and they fight and they do for what they believe is right about what they need to do and take care of their own. But I'm with you. This is tough to live by this code. I mean, I get what they're trying to do. And I think, again, you go back and you look, this is really early on, and it makes sense this is where they're at. So it's not necessarily a critique of writing or anything like that. It makes sense that this is very early in the journey, and they only have it within the context of this planet, and they're basically learning how to manage the planet within the context of themselves, which isn't, when you leave that planet, then things go crazy. And maybe that's why we have like the Rakata and some of these other places, these other pockets of Force users now that they have a very different perspective on it, and that's why you have conflict with with kind of the mother Jedi, if you will, or the Jedi primes, if you will, the descendants of Tho Yor, effectively, and the direct descendants of the Dai Bendu and those original clans that came through.
What's not clear too in this era, just to be clear, is that sounded funny. But what's not clear is the Tho Yor's influence on the Jedi. The temples are still there. The pyramids, all of these pyramids, eventually, some of them became temples, and they're they never go away. We know that they would go back and reflect in front of these temples, but we don't know if the Tho Yor continued to speak or invite them to more enlightenment in any way. Again, it's just not in the comics, and there's really not a whole lot in this era outside of these 15 comic books, honestly. Right. So, presumably, and where I was going with this is I was curious, I've always wondered, did this code come about because it was given to them by the Tho Yor and said, here's what you need to live by because you're on this planet, or just live by because this is how we view the Force? Or was it through, their scholars or through academia that they were somehow able to come up with this Jedi code? Either way, I do like the idea that maybe they do introduce some kind of a new Jedi code, and if it's not in our face, they just they speak to it or they act to it in some way that we can interpret that. Oh yeah, they're kind of calling back to the Jedi code instead of what we see now. And to be fair, both the Sith code and the Jedi code, JEDI code, are probably not that easy to live up to as well. Let's just be clear, because there's some. I mean, they're better, I think, but we've seen some people fall because of them as well.
I like the idea that they would actually be verbatim about what the code is in this type of timeline in the movie.
Yeah, I can see that.
Because I think it gives you a really stark difference. I think that helps bring the audience along of saying, what is the mentality of the Jedi, and how is that different from what we know?
Right.
And that brings you into that space really quickly and somewhat immediately. You don't have to do a lot of prologue to figure some of that out, because once you start to share that within the context of training and master and apprenticeship, and we didn't really talk about the different levels of what their journey. They have journeyers and things like that. They don't have the concepts of Jedi Knights and things like that quite yet. But they've got those different elements. But within those training contexts of what it means to escalate to the next level, having that code brought in makes a lot of sense to be able to say, these are the values and the morals that we bring up with, and here are the challenges you have it, and then you clearly articulate over the course of the movie what it is why it's so difficult to do that, and why potentially it may not work, and then maybe why you get different sects of how you get Jedi versus Sith in the long run, right? Mm-hmm. And again, I think that's the interesting part of how long does it take for us to get to the Sith if the intent is to name the Sith at some point in a movie that explores Dawn of the Jedi or Dawn of the Sith or age, these ancient ages of the Republic type of mentality, or storylines and mentality of how we want to approach Star Wars in the way past.
Yeah. There's again, I think there's a lot that's good of this series, honestly, and I would encourage anybody. I know we only broke down the first 5 issues. Let's see, what is it they want afterwards? It's Force War, or is it the last one?
No, that's Prisoner Bogan is the next one.
Prisoner Bogan, yeah, and so that focuses on Zesh and Dalen Locke, their kind of relationship, what they do, what they end up doing, fulfilling. Basically, Dalen Locke is trying to fulfill his prophecy. His prophecy is he sees himself running with lightsabers in his hand. He doesn't know what they are yet, but he sees himself in his vision. That was the vision that he had, and so then here's suddenly this dude shows up and he's got a Force saber, or knows about him, and so they go on that journey. And then the very last part of it is kind of the Rakata. Rakata eventually come to the planet. Zesh is now part of the good guys, and they go on and fight against the Rakata, and I won't spoil the ending and how that goes, but that's there. And again, there's some good parts in there too. Like it pulls away a lot in the second and third arcs. It pulls away from a lot of the world building stuff that we've already talked about. It gets more into the characters and the relationships and that sort of thing. So if that's of interest, then it's worth reading. If not, you probably can read these first 5 issues and probably get some really good deep stuff, like, to put a show together to talk about the origins of the Force and the Jedi. So, right. But okay, well, no, it was fun. I'm glad we finally got to talk about it. And in hour 2, we will talk about. I'm kidding. Jonesy's got to edit this show, so I'll let you off the hook, man. This was fun, though. I enjoyed talking about Dawn Jedi. We need to come back to this era. There's so many good things, honestly, that now that we're starting to kind of maybe, pull that back a little bit and get into some of this, dip our toe into the SWTOR and KOTOR eras, that there's some future show content that we can do around this stuff as well.
You never know.
Never know. Hey, do you want to say thank you to anybody that came out tonight?
Yeah, Skywars Academy, Sky, Alex, thank you all for coming out and joining us on the live stream. Do you want to give a little preview about what we're going to do on Thursday?
Yeah, Thursday we are going to do, I think we're calling it an Ahsoka primer. So we're going to start kind of our Ahsoka.
I had to think of a better title for YouTube than that, but yeah.
Yeah, that could mean a lot of different things, honestly, and probably more than an hour show. But we're going to basically start the media bandwagon here, if you will, or the hype machine for the Ahsoka series. So as we mentioned earlier, we've got all the fact poise coming up with Star Wars Rebels, but we're going to do an Ahsoka series. And so we'll touch on some of the aspects that I think are going to probably be more important, more relevant as a refresher of sorts, getting into, the Ahsoka series. So we'll touch on Rebels, specifically those last episodes with oh gosh, draw a blank on the name now. World Between Worlds. Thank you, Nobody Me. World Between Worlds. We'll get into some of that. We'll get into some of the stuff that happened in Rebels, and then of course we'll get into what we saw in the Ahsoka series. We'll get into some Thrawn. So basically, some of the stuff, the basic stuff that you'll need to get started with the Ahsoka series. So that'll be Thursday night, 9 p.m. starting here, 9 p.m. Central on YouTube.
And that'll be open for everyone. So cantinacast.com/YouTube if you want to find it. Of course, on the podcast, it'll be front and center there, and on the website, all that good stuff.
Yep. Okay, we will call it a night and be back here in just a couple days for that episode. So until then, we will see ya.
You're still listening? Wow. That's amazing. Well, I'm here to give you the disclaimer. Normally we do a big, long, drawn-out disclaimer thing saying what's what and who's what and all that other stuff, but I think you guys kind of know that Lucasfilm and Disney have no affiliation with us at all, and we have none with them. We talk about Star Wars, which is their property, and all that other good, fun stuff, but I think you can tell which is our stuff and which is their stuff. If you can't, well, then send a lawyer to send an email to me, and I'll be glad to chat with them. Other than that, you know what's what, so that's your disclaimer.